Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Good morning and welcome. My name is Martin Roy. I work in the Trade and Services Division in the WTO Secretariat. I'm pleased to have you join us today at the public forum, either joining us online. I understand this event is being webcast, or joining us in person in this room. For those of you who are not used to the WTO premises, this is a very nice room. It's a room that has seen a lot of multilateral actions take shape over time. Also some inactions in the past, but some time back. This session is co-organized by the World Bank and the WTO, and it focuses on trade and services. Services is at the center of economic transformation. It is the fastest growing segment of world trade in recent time, despite the COVID crisis. Services exports of developing countries have more than tripled since 2005, outpacing the growth of services export of developed economies. And a good part of that growth is linked to services that are delivered electronically. Our session today stems from the recent publication by the World Bank and the WTO, which is called Trade and Services for Development. And that provides some context and background for our discussion today. That publication was launched by Dr. Ngozi and the World Bank President Ajay Banga in July, and it stresses how services trade provides an important tool for development, for trade opportunities for developing countries, while also acknowledging that services trade also presents some particular challenges. That report launched by the two organizations was essentially a call to action on two main streams. One was a call to action to re-energize the services trade agenda at the WTO, aiming to deepen international cooperation so as to lower barriers to trade, provide for greater transparency and predictability. And also a second objective was to set out an agenda designed to help developing countries increase their participation in world trade in services, and to take advantage of the opportunities that this presents. In pursuing these two objectives, the report proposed a Trade and Services for Development initiative that spelled out a roadmap for aid for trade in this area. Five broad elements were highlighted in the report, and we'll touch on some of that today. So that includes improving data on services trade, increasing participation of developing countries in LDCs and services deliberations, strengthening regulatory frameworks and enforcement capacities, helping to diversify export baskets, including through digitization, and addressing key supply side constraints, including through an upgrading of skills. So in this session today, we're happy to bring together distinguished speakers from different perspectives to discuss the role that Aid for Trade can play in helping developing countries reap the benefits of trade and services. And the panelists will also debate and discuss how expanded trade in services can be facilitated by domestic reforms and by international cooperation in the WTO and elsewhere. So let me briefly introduce our panel of speakers to you this morning. You're able to see all the detailed information on the forum's website. So first we have Rupa Chanda, who is Director of Trade, Investment and Innovation at UNESCAP in Bangkok. She is a well-known trade and services expert, which has written extensively on these topics throughout her distinguished career. We're also honored to have with us the ambassador and permanent representative of the Pacific Island Forum to the WTO, Ambassador Falemaka. The ambassador has a distinguished career serving the Pacific Islands in Geneva, as well as in the Pacific, also in the Fijian public service. We're also delighted that Graham Floater can join us. Graham is the Director for Trade in Services, Investment, and Digital in the United Kingdom's Department for Business and Trade in London. In addition to the multilateral level, he also took part and oversaw the UK's participation in services negotiations in free trade agreement. And we also are glad to have Sébastien Dessus, which is the manager of the Global Trade and Regional Integration Unit at the World Bank, and Sébastien has also an extensive and distinguished career at the bank. He is one of the key interlocutors for the WTO on trade matters, and he also oversaw our recent study, joint study on trade and services. As you saw, as you would have seen, the title for this session suggests the need to wake the sleeping giant. And the sleeping giant, of course, is the service sector, and the service sector in relation to trade. Service sector being the most important contributor to jobs, economic activity in different countries, but maybe not getting the level of policy attention that the economic importance suggests in the WTO and elsewhere. So we hope that our panelists will be able to provide us some insights in terms of how to wake this sleeping giant. There are different options. One could possibly nudge the giant to try to awaken the giant, him or her. But of course, there's a risk that then the giant just falls back asleep. There are other options: strong coffee, exposure to bright light, and then more radical options that I won't go into. But so we'll hope to hear some of that. So let us start. I will ask each panelist to limit their interventions to about 10 minutes. So this should allow us enough time to get some questions from the floor and to have a discussion with you, and for panelists to come back and comment on what others have said. So let us start with Rupa Chanda from UNESCAP. Rupa, I've mentioned at the outset that services trade offers important export opportunities for developing countries, but also some challenges. So if you could tell us a bit about the ways you see from your experience, the ways you see to help developing countries increase their participation in services trade, including in terms of addressing some of the data challenges that are faced by those countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. And special thanks to World Bank and WTO for this opportunity to share some thoughts. I don't know if what I say will help awaken the sleeping giant or not. Some medicine is required, obviously, and I'll be speaking on the basics, which is data. I'd like to just structure my response in 3 parts. First is just to give us some background on the kinds of limitations that are there in services trade. We need to appreciate the whole host of challenges that are there with services trade data, and also in general on services data, because I think the two are quite closely linked. And what implications they have in terms of policy making, trade negotiations, etc. The second is, of course, addressing what international organizations or regional organizations like ours, UNESCAP, can do to address this problem. And third, I'd like to, if time permits, to speak briefly on the digital services trade part, because data capture there is extremely important. So, when you look at the challenges in terms of services trade policy, there are many. One is just because of lack of data, the difficulties in assessing what your strengths and weaknesses are in the service sector, the role services play in the larger economy in terms of productivity, innovation, growth, etc. It's very difficult to analyze that impact. What's the impact of services liberalization or restrictions and other regulatory measures that affect services trade? There's difficulty in engaging in trade negotiations because of lack of detailed information. And of course, what kind of regulatory and other institutional frameworks are needed to support services trade, what reforms are needed. And Martin has touched upon those. The common factor underpinning all of these challenges is really lack of credible, consistent, good quality, and sufficiently disaggregated data that really constrains informed and evidence-based policymaking. And we do have some data sets and, like BATIS, TISMOS, TIVA, etc., STRI, but there is a lot of limitation in terms of coverage, country coverage, subsectoral coverage, modal coverage, because services trade is so different from goods trade. So let me just outline some of those limitations. The first is lack of consistent, uniformly available time series data across countries on services trade at the disaggregated level. We all know services trade is extremely heterogeneous, and there's a whole range of activities that are involved in services trade. So if you take something just like transport services, you have air transport, maritime transport, surface transport, you might not get detailed information, but for different countries, these specific types of service subsectors within transport services may be very important. Another area that comes to mind is other business services. This is a very growing area, but the kind of detailed set of activities that are there, and these vary again across countries, and especially with the advent of digital services trade, the other businesses services component is growing like anything. So these challenges are going to grow in future as more and more services become tradable. And if you can't capture the kinds of activities at a disaggregated level, it becomes hard to inform your policymaking or your trade negotiations. Second is the modal lack of information. Of course, we have the TISMOS database. We have it at a broad sectoral level. But again, when you go within services, actually, even at the sectoral level, you find a lot of missing information. And if you go within the services, for instance, I take the example of health services. Mode 4 is extremely important in health services, but the kind of detail that you would need by the types of categories of personnel, you don't really have it. And you'll have to triangulate with various sources of information to get that, and it's not available, or you have to use mirror sources of information from immigration statistics, workers' compensation, income, bilateral information if it's available. So again, you can't really get a good idea of how much mode-wise trade is happening, especially in something like Mode 4, which is very poorly captured. Third is the lack of bilateral trade data on services. Again, of course, we have BATIS, we have OECD TIVA database from which you can estimate. But at this time, bilateral data is there for less than 70% of global services trade. And if you go into specific services, it's even less represented. There's also a lot of variation in the availability of the bilateral trade statistics across countries and regions. So there's a lot of estimation, adjustment, mirror imaging that is done to capture this data. But basically, if you look at something like OECD TIVA database, while its coverage is expanding, but a lot of countries, especially the ones that are poor in terms of the services trade data, which need the capacity, those are the countries that are not covered. So how do you negotiate then bilaterally if you don't know who are your main partners, which are the subsectors in which you have trade flows with those particular countries? It's very difficult. Fourth limitation, I would say, is lack of comprehensive information on foreign affiliates, trade and services statistics. This is a very important mode of trade and services. And again, we don't have the kind of detailed information by partners, host country, destination, subsectors, etc. Again, how do you look at the impact of liberalization of Mode 3 if you don't have the data on your partners and you don't have subsectoral information? Fifth is actually national statistics. It's not just about trade, because you often have to look at the concordance, how is trade impacting on other national parameters? What are the national flows? So a lot of the empirical work gets constrained even by this. So for instance, detailed information on services with regard to employment, FDI, input-output tables, value-added information. I can name a range of these, but if you don't have that, and then the classifications are very different, then it's hard to do the concordance. So this is something that I think, looking at national data indicators and looking at the trade data, all this has to have a lot more correspondence. A sixth is about firm level information. We know that a lot of the empirical work, a lot of the analysis today is really resting at the firm level. And if you look at countries, there are, plant level data sets available, there's firm level databases available, but when it comes to services, service sector enterprises, this kind of data is lacking. And in fact, if you look at recent trends like servicification, for instance, even for the manufacturing industries, the level of capture of the data of how much services are being used, in-house services, outsourced services, this kind of detailed information is not there. This, I'm really going to even extended levels of disaggregation that are required, but it's important. If you want to look at firm level productivity and this kind of evidence, then you need firm level databases, you need enterprise surveys to be done. And sometimes there are legislative issues actually in even getting a survey of services industries. I was looking at the Indian one. We have the annual survey of industries, but trying to get it for the service sector, very difficult. And there's also a problem that a lot of service sector enterprises are not registered. So you have to capture it again through other sorts of databases, tax authorities, et cetera, and again, triangulate information. Final issue is, quantifying barriers to services trade. There is the services trade policy database, the STRI, but there are issues of country sectoral coverage. Time-wise, you have just points of time data. It's not there for many countries. It's not there for many sectors. There are issues with the methodology. It's also not well understood often. So how do you actually look at the impact of border and behind the border regulations and their impact? And how do you quantify this? It's much easier in goods, but in services, very hard to do. So all of this is really pointing to lack of official national statistics, lack of capacity at the national level, maybe lack of legislation to push this through. The problem that services are so heterogeneous and there's no one ministry. You're looking at many line ministries that have, and you need a lot of interagency coordination. You have regulatory bodies which are statutory and independent and getting information from them. So, all this basically hampers your ability to understand your trade flows, your sources of comparative advantage, how you negotiate, etc. So how do we address this problem? What role can international organizations and regional organizations play? So first, I would say is just even with the experimental databases, incremental progress in improving them coverage-wise, subsector-wise, country-wise. That is, of course, the base level that we need. Second is to work, I would say, in three parts. One is to work with the national statistical agencies and to try and improve the indicators that you have with regard to value added, investment, input, output related information, because you also need to capture that much in much more detail and on a much more consistent basis. So this would require actually not just working with the trade ministries, but as I mentioned, working with many line ministries, the regulatory bodies, the industry chambers. And the sharing of knowledge, best practices, and this kind of coordination and convening role is very important for the international organizations. I think one thing here is working with central banks, which do collect a lot of the foreign exchange information, the tax authorities, and the survey agencies. These are some of the entities you need to really bring together. The second part of the assistance is to work with the preparation and design of national surveys and to capture the subsectors, activities, modes of supply, and also with sharing of methodologies so that countries understand better what's underlying some of the quantification work that's been done. And the third is the impact analysis. I think there also much help may be required in looking at the trends and patterns and then understanding the impact of restrictions or liberalization. This really means a lot of technical and financial assistance needs to go towards capacity building of statistical and other agencies to identify gaps, provide training in survey design and administration, data collection, estimation, and to convene this do this coordination role. I think another very important thing is to work on service sector firm registration and working on enterprise surveys. This might be one way, and which agencies can help in this process. I think international organizations have to bring them together. And lastly, on digital services trade, this is a very, very difficult area. I know there's recent work trying to capture this data well. But because it's hard to capture and so many new services are emerging, it has implications for how you design your tax policies, how you negotiate, what do you put into trade agreements and various provisions. So I think here IOs as well as the regional organizations can assist by providing data, one on digital services, trade trends, what is available for countries, doing some of the evidence, the analysis on impact of restrictions and doing fiscal impact assessment. I think this is very important. And of course, there's the larger issue of digital trade, which is skilling, technology adoption, working with MSMEs, et cetera, which I'm sure other speakers will talk about. So thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you very much. I think we've come a long way actually over the last 10, 15 years in terms of data, but there's still very important gaps, and this is a key input to all types of activities on services where mobilization is still needed to really continue to advance on that front. Let me now turn to the ambassador. Ambassador, Pacific Islands, in view of their geographical situation, have to cope with challenges associated with remoteness and scale, and this may suggest a need to look at services. So I think what we would like to hear from you is to hear from you how you see services in terms of the development objectives of Pacific Island countries, and how you see aid for trade play a role with respect to trade and services, and how that may link to other efforts at the multilateral level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. And let me, first of all, thank the WTO and the World Bank for organizing this really important session for us. The Pacific Island Forum has 18 members, which include Australia and New Zealand. My work is to represent the Pacific Island countries, the 14 Pacific Island countries, and of course we now have 2 territories. I appreciate very much the invitation to participate at this panel, and I wanted to answer your question with 3 points. The first is to highlight the importance of the services sector to the Pacific Islands. The Pacific Island Forum Secretariat fully acknowledges the crucial role of services in the modern economies of our members. Services have been long recognized as a primary source of investment, of income and employment, including for women and youth. And this is also true for the Pacific, where according to the World Bank, in 2022, services accounted for about 53% of the gross domestic product, or GDP, and 52% of total employment, as well as 61% of female employment in the Pacific countries. I should say that when you look across the Pacific countries, we have 2 main sectors. Given the nature of our economies, as Martin has explained, we are small island states. So the 2 main sectors are services and fisheries. Tourism remains the backbone of many Pacific countries. On this sector, we learned a lot of lessons from the COVID pandemic, with the disruption in trade, with the disruptions to travel and connectivity. Many of the tourism sectors in the islands collapsed. A lot of unemployment resulted. And post-COVID, we have learned to try to build resilience to the in the services sector, and not to rely on a sector such as tourism. Although important for many of us, we also see how vulnerable the tourism sector can be when we face an international or an external shock, as we saw with the COVID pandemic. So at the same time, having learned those lessons, we also recognize that services are the backbone of an enabling business environment, including in the Pacific. Services such as transport and logistics are playing a crucial role in facilitating the trade in goods, and are moving to complement other multilateral and regional trade agreements. At the same time, we also see the development in the logistics and services, that beyond logistics and services, additional foundations for our countries will need to be built, particularly in the areas of the economic infrastructure services, such as telecommunications. Many Pacific countries had undergone a liberalization in these areas, particularly in the telecom sector, back in the 1990s, early 2000s, that have opened up telecommunication sector. So the challenge for us, though, is not so much about accessibility. It's more about affordability of the access to information and communication technology on the use of internet. We take, for example, the case of Vanuatu, where the price of a 2 GB internet package has decreased from 61 US dollars in 2013 to about $8 US in 2021. So the liberalization of this sector has opened up competition and has reduced prices to make this accessible to a lot of the business people and consumers, in particularly the small business sector. With the advances in technology and affordable internet, ICT-enabled services have become a reality also for our region, and we have seen these developments across the world. The ICT developments have increased the number of digitally deliverable services, making the sector more tradable, more contestable, and productive. And thanks to this development, the Pacific Islands can latch onto this platform, although remote as they are in terms of their geographical isolation. They are able to participate using these ICT-enabled platforms. And one of the areas where development is growing is the outsourcing sector, outsourcing of services. And this is a very important and growing sector for our region, given the time zone differences between this side of the world and our side of the world. So while this side of the world sleeps, we can do your work in the region. So feel free to take advantage of those time zones. But that is a sector where the Pacific Islands are looking to diversify the services sector. We have also in the smaller scale areas, we have small businesses, individual clients that are also benefiting from the fact that the whole world has been brought to our doorstep as a result of this ICT-enabled technology. Take, for example, the case of Sabina, a lady in Fiji that has clients in the UK, in the US, and in Thailand, among others. And she charges $10 US per hour for her remote work as a copywriter, which is approximately her charges of US $10 per hour is approximately 5 times the minimum wage in Fiji, a rate that would be difficult to match for similar work undertaken domestically. So there are these benefits of ICT services that is even reaching the smaller scale businesses. And this brings me to the second point that I wanted to say today. Having recognized the importance of services, the challenges we face as by relying on one single sector of the services sector, the need to diversify, the potentials that are emerging. My second point is now there's recognition to move towards a structured approach to develop and nurture the services sector in the region. In that regard, the Pacific Aid for Trade Strategy 2020 to 2025 includes services as one of the thematic pillars to help develop the Pacific Island countries develop their capacity to develop the services sector and, of course, trade-in services. So over the past year, the Forum Secretariat has been coordinating a successful regional initiative in a number of areas, which include quality infrastructure and e-commerce. We are also taking the same strategy to develop a Pacific strategy on services, or Pacific Trade-in Services Initiative, which will focus on the development of harmonized country studies through national assessments based on the methodology that will be developed by the Secretariat with input from partners such as UNSCAP, the WTO, and UNCTAD. These studies will eventually be consolidated into a regional assessment from which a Pacific regional strategy on trade-in services development will be developed. In fact, a concept note on this approach is now being proposed for the Forum Trade Ministers meeting that will take place in the first week of October. So once the ministers endorse that approach, work will then begin, which brings us to the third point that I wanted to raise, and that is the link between the work that we're doing and the WTO World Bank initiative on trade-in services for development. Our approach is basically, we see the World Bank WTO Trade-in Services Initiative as complementing the work that we are beginning to do. And we will use those assessments to undertake a number of national assessments in the countries, in the Pacific countries. First, to look at the role of services in the economy, the contribution of services to GDP, to employment, to investment, and so forth. Second, and which brings me to the important point that Rupa had mentioned, the importance of data. From the available data that we have, what are the trends on trade in services in the region? Third, what is the state of play on services trade policies and regulations in the Pacific Islands? And third, how competitive is our services sector or our services industries, and what opportunities exist that can be promoted and where export opportunities can be built. So those assessments will then form the outcome of those assessments will then form the baseline on which we will develop the regional strategy. And here, I just wanted to highlight that we look forward to working and engaging with the WTO and the World Bank on their initiative. First, we welcome very much their participation in the work that we are doing in the region to develop a strategy for a structured approach to the services sector development in the Pacific. We also would like to indicate our interest in being an active partner in the Trade in Services Development Initiative that the WTO and the World Bank has launched. And second, we would also be interested in leveraging the expertise of international organizations like the World Bank, the UNSCAP, the WTO, in peer reviewing the work that we will do as a result of the assessments that we will undertake. And third, our request also is to the World Bank and the WTO to ensure that their services trade restrictiveness index database could be extended to cover all of the Pacific countries so that we could also have some data. But we do take the point that Rupa has made, that data is an important element of policy, and that will also be part of the work that we will be doing. Thank you very much, Martin.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Very interesting. Very interesting to hear also what you mentioned about the role of services in terms of promoting diversification, which is a key objective for many countries, and the role of services sectors or digital services, both as enablers of new activities and new trade, and also as an export in themselves in terms of the ICT services. Thank you. So let's now turn to Graham. Graham, you have taken part and you have also overseen a number of FTA negotiations on services trade in which the UK has been involved. And I think like many other countries engaged in services FTAs, but we'd like to hear from you maybe what lessons, you know, could be drawn, or you think could be drawn for the WTO's effort on services trade. And maybe as a follow-up to that, in what ways do you think the WTO and greater international cooperation on services trade can bring benefits and can help enhance predictability and transparency of services trade regimes? Graham, please.
Thank you very much, Martin. And first of all, many thanks for the invitation to be on the panel with such distinguished panelists. And thank you also to the WTO and the World Bank for what we think is an excellent report. It's what I think all reports should be like. It's clear, it is thought-provoking, and most importantly of all, it's evidence-based. And as Rupa was saying, we really do need to understand as much as we can about services, and the more data, the more information, the more evidence that we have, the better the decisions that we can make more broadly. In terms of the context for us in the UK, most people would know that we are a service-based economy, about 80% of our GDP. What is perhaps less well known is that it makes up 82% of the UK's employment. And it's jobs as much as anything else that drives our objectives in terms of the services economy. What does that mean for the UK economy, first of all? Where have we come from in terms of our thinking and our approach? Well, one of the things that is foremost in our mind is that services is for everybody across the United Kingdom. We find growth in services across all our regions. And interestingly, although the perception might be that it's all based in and around London, some of the high growth areas in services in the UK are in the regions. It is also important for particular businesses. Women-owned businesses can thrive in this sector. As the report itself says, around about 60% of women are employed in the services sector globally. I thought it was very interesting what the ambassador was saying about a similar statistic for the Pacific. And we find ourselves that this is a really important sector, not only for employment for women, but also an ever-increasing number of women entrepreneurs, women-owned businesses who can access global markets in a way that they simply couldn't even 10 years ago. And why is that? Well, it's all down to the digital economy. It is now much easier to enter global markets, even if you're an individual without many resources, as long as you can have access to a computer and a telecoms network, and that's something we need to work on globally, there's no doubt about that. But more and more people in the world are having this access, and we're finding that there are so many people around the world, women and men, with great ideas that they are putting into practice in terms of their services businesses. Again, very interesting what the ambassador was saying about Sabina and selling her services right across the world. at 5 times the average wage, I think the ambassador said. There are real opportunities here, and we certainly see that in the UK. Micro businesses, small businesses, these are the businesses who can really benefit from the services economy. That's what we're finding in the UK, and it's not slowing down. It's also about underserved communities and those regions where individual companies, individuals themselves would 10 to 20 years ago and not have been able to access those global markets. They can now. And that is a real leveler. It makes it fairer and it gives opportunities to many more people. So that's a real lesson that we've learned in the UK in our own experience of growing our services economy. And that goes hand in hand with the growth in the digital economy. And that really has driven our approach to our regional trade agreements, our FTAs, and also our approach here in the WTO. Over the last 2 to 3 years, we have concluded agreements, FTAs with Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Norway. We have concluded the discussions to join CPTPP and the 11 members in the Asia Pacific region as well. So we've been busy, and at the heart of all of that is services and the digital economy. We see this as not the future, but the real economy today. And I think we need to appreciate that. And for those of us working multilaterally in the WTO, we definitely need to appreciate that and recognize that the world is moving at pace. And what this report shows is that it's moving everywhere to more and more services that are being delivered, with the opportunities that come from that, both in terms of those entrepreneurs, those small businesses, and also jobs. What have we been negotiating? Well, a whole array of different services provisions. And I'm not going to go into the details here. It would take a rather long time for anyone who's gone through a services schedule. But for us, it is very important in the UK that we cover all services sectors that are important right across the economy. In terms of the digital component to this, not only have we been interested in pushing forward on digital chapters within our FTAs, but we've also concluded an agreement with Singapore on a digital economy agreement, a much more wide-ranging agreement of provisions that not only cover the more perhaps traditional areas of digital trade and e-commerce, but also go into areas of cooperation. We need to think about the future. Technology is rapidly changing, and we've got to adapt to that. And that means that we need to play a role in trade alongside our colleagues in other government ministries. And that is an area where I think we need to understand how we can do better on the multilateral stage. And of course, the JI in e-commerce is one way of doing that, but not the only one. And we need to work, as I say, with our colleagues to understand how we can deliver for our people, for citizens, for society in a way that we didn't need to think about 10 years ago, because the digital economy is changing our lives in the way that we live. And services is very much at the heart of all of that. We have explored new provisions. We have one on legal tech, which is the first time in a trade agreement that has been included with Singapore. We've covered fintech. We've covered all kinds of different areas of technologies of the future, and we need to future-proof as well, because we don't want to simply agree on what the world looks like today without understanding that the world is going to look very different even next week for any of us who read the technology magazines on a regular basis. So we see this as very important in terms of our bilateral engagement. We know there are many others out there who share those interests. But I think it's in terms of this report and its emphasis on developing countries that makes it particularly interesting, because services are not just important for countries like the UK. And the evidence here makes that clear. We've seen that the GDP share of services in low-income economies increased from 36% to 42%, and it's on a continuing trend upwards over a period of 50 years. We in the UK appreciate that, and we understand that we have a part to play as well to work with our friends and colleagues in other parts of the world, and that's why we've been supporting developing members to trade in services with the implementation, for instance, of our LDC services waiver, which grants more favourable market access for service providers from those least developed countries. We've also looked at the way in which we can understand better through better data what the benefits are for our friends. And UK services imports, we know from the 35 least developed countries who are members of the WTO, amounted to £1.4 billion in 2022. That is a scale that is increasing, and it's one that we need to appreciate. And that's why also in consultations on our international development white paper, we are exploring ways in which we can improve data collection for services trade with developing members so that we can make it as inclusive as possible. And finally, we are also rolling out our international tech hub network. This allows entrepreneurs in developing countries, we've had a really good program in Africa, bringing them together with those who can provide know-how and investment so that they can realize their dreams and go that step further to growing their businesses. What can we learn in the WTO? Well, I think there are a number of things. First of all, if we're going to move forward and if we're going to share these benefits fairly across the world, we do need to be inclusive. And that means more than rhetoric. We need to ensure that we have consistency, we have transparency, and the WTO is a great place to make that happen. We should be having these conversations more. It should be about knowledge sharing as well. And it should be about how we can increase the opportunities for developing countries, understand the benefits of digitalization, but also how services can tackle global challenges. Another key message from this report. And one could imagine something like environmental services, for instance, being able to bring together the benefits of services with tackling some of our most urgent challenges, including climate change. So there's much there for us to do. We shouldn't underestimate the challenge, but it's certainly a very exciting area. And thank you once again for this report.
Thank you, Graham. I think one thing I note from your intervention is that, I mean, we often say, and this is very true, that services trade is the future of trade, but it is also the present. And I guess this suggests that we should not defer our actions in the future also, but look at what we can do now. Let's now turn to Sébastien. So Sébastien, you've been, of course, very involved in this report, and the report highlights 5 key elements that I briefly mentioned at the beginning in terms of a possible aid for trade roadmap in services trade to help advance the participation of developing countries, to bring benefits in terms of their participation in world trade. Can you tell us what the World Bank is doing in that regard, how the current strands of work in the World Bank can help advance this, and also tell us a bit about the emerging priorities or future priorities in that regard? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Martin. Good morning, everybody. It's a great opportunity to engage with you all on this very important topic. We write these reports indeed to stimulate those discussions at the global level or multilateral level with institutions like today, but also at the country levels. So I'll go into the topic, but I want to say at the outset that give you a sense of what we do at the bank, and maybe that's part of already an answer to your question, and particularly the trade team. So we are doing two things, basically. One is to try to better understand what is happening in the world, global trends, opportunities, and challenges to leverage trade for development. So we're writing reports on trade in services, digital trade, trade and health, trade and climate, etc. And that's one part of our work. But maybe a more important part of our work is to directly support teams on the ground, World Bank teams on the ground, to implement projects, be it on the trade facilitation side or financing project, but also in terms of helping countries to reform wherever it's needed and improve their regulatory frameworks. And so we do a lot of work at the cross-cutting level on trade, on investment, but also at the sectoral level, energy, infrastructure, education, finance, etc., to really try to help improve those regulatory frameworks, to provide better services, be more inclusive, providing the right level playing field, which eventually will attract those investments that are needed to amplify and reward the efforts that are being made by countries to strengthen their regulations. And I think that's from this dual view of things that I think we can bring something to the table, because we see both the need to move on the multilateral front, but also the need to move at the country level. And I think there's an intersection which I will talk about very soon, and can be extremely powerful in my opinion. So to come back to your question, Martin, I'd say yes. Okay, we've written this report. You've written this report, and Pierre's written this report, and encourage you all to read this report. And I'll say a few words on it to highlight a few key, to provide some evidence on a few features that I've already mentioned, but I want to mention them briefly again, underline them briefly again. First, the services and trade in services has a strong potential to address a lot of current global issues: climate, digital divide, financial inclusion, human capital gaps, health, education, better logistical services, and the like. So there's a global agenda here. We see too that developing countries have a lot to gain in developing their services and participating more to trade in services, to export, but also to import those services that may help people directly, improve the welfare of people, or help firms to grow, to diversify, to become more competitive. And we see too that in doing so, developing countries can become much more inclusive. I mean, there's a great inclusivity reward, because services are demanding skills and capacity that marginalized groups have: the youth, the women, the small enterprises. So it's a great combination of things, and we know that as you said, trade in services is happening, is something. It's a reality. It's also a reality for developing countries, and we want to amplify that reality and make it even more impactful from a development perspective. And we also know, as has been said too, that services should not be seen in isolation of the rest of the economy. Services is increasingly an input to the goods sector, to the manufacturing sector, to agriculture, and it makes those more traditional sectors much more productive and effective, competitive, and so it affects also trade in goods directly. I just take one example because to highlight this point, we sponsored some research on the impact on the restriction of trading services on trading goods and the link between STRIs and trading goods. And one thing that struck me very much, because I worked a lot on Africa, is how influential was regulation in transport on agricultural trade. The movement of agricultural goods between African countries is extremely dependent on the level of restriction in transports in Africa. We know it, but when you get the evidence, I think it's much more powerful to engage in a discussion with the various countries. And so this kind of work that brings together those various elements is extremely important. Now, it has been mentioned that trading service has grown tremendously in recent years, and that we see that as a result of two main factors. One is technological progress, and in particular progress on the digital front. That's very important, but also it is a result of progress made by countries themselves in improving their regulatory frameworks, and that's very important. And those efforts have been, in most cases, made on a unilateral basis without any trade framework or without committing to a trade agreement directly, and they are by nature very often non-discriminatory. And I think this is very important. And we've seen that when those regulatory frameworks have been improved, they have a big impact on investment. On foreign direct investment. This is what is attracting foreign direct investment, or even the retention of domestic investment, or attraction of domestic investment in sectors, is the quality of the regulatory framework. And that is very important to mention that, because when we are talking about what is the role of trade in that regard, it has implication. The challenge today is to consolidate and scale up those efforts made at the country level. Again, because consolidation will be, in my opinion, not only in my opinion, but the opinion of the World Bank, the way to amplify the impact of those reforms that have been taken at the country level through a greater foreign direct attractiveness. And you remember that a big part of the trading services happens through mode 3 and the establishment of foreign firms and affiliates in countries, and this is so there's through foreign direct investment. So maybe one thing that we could say is that one of the roles we could see for the resumption, for wakening up this sleeping giant, and is to be able to help countries lock in their commitments, things that they've already done, into international agreements, regional or multilateral agreements, so that's to give the credibility to foreign investors that those agreements, those regulations are going to stay, are going to be secure, are going to be stable, and that gives the visibility needed by foreign investor or even domestic investor to invest further into those investment opportunities, into those sectors where regulations have improved, and so as to amplify even further the impact of those reforms. I think that's a very important component. And the second role, of course, that we can play at the multilateral level is to further support countries' effort to improve their regulations and to record them into trade agreements. So I really want to focus to underline the very importance of locking in domestic reforms into trade agreements. So what can we do for that? So we are working at the World Bank, for instance, to try to understand the gaps between the states of regulation today in a country and their current commitments, and see whether this gap could be reduced. That's one thing we do. We are working with countries directly to improve their capacity, but that's mostly I would say country level engagement. But if I were to select two most important things going forward, I would come back to what Rupa said. I think it is clear that without a better understanding of the extent of trading services, the nature of trading services by mode, by source, by origin, by destination, by sector, etc., it is very difficult to move the needle more globally. So big efforts need to be made there. The second one, on which we are particularly involved at the World Bank, with the WTO, with the OECD, with other partners, is really trying to better understand, and again, building on our knowledge at the sectoral level in countries of regulations and institutional framework, the level of restrictions in trade and services. We mentioned service trade restrictiveness index, audits more generally. We now have about 130 countries which are being covered, but it's only one observation. We need to create time series. We need to deepen our understanding, because it is becoming a key feature of trade policy and development policy more broadly overall, on which we would like to make a lot of progress. So we are looking for partnership to further accelerate this work on these two aspects of the data: extent of trading services, nature of trading services, extent and nature of restriction and policies. And I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sébastien. I think one of the key points you mentioned, because it was also reflected in the report, is that there are these two aspects. So I don't know if that's the two legs of the giant, but anyway, the international cooperation, and also the domestic side and assistance that is being provided to boost the services sector nationally in different countries and help increase participation in services trade. And these two legs, or these two components, kind of complement each other and can amplify each other's impact. Thank you to all. Now I'm happy to take a few questions from the floor. I'll take a few at a time, and then I'll let the panelists respond. If you can try to be brief and introduce yourself. So I'll take a few at a time. So maybe I take the three here. Please, sir.
Thank you so much. My name is Mohit Basin. I am a partner with KPMG, and I lead the economic growth practice for KPMG globally. Just to give you context about my background, I had the privilege of working in India on the World Bank Doing Business ranking, which moved significantly up. And I also had the privilege of implementing the WTO Trade Facilitation Program, TFA. Now, both of them are pretty powerful instruments. The World Bank Doing Business really simplifies, and TFA really creates the common denominator. And I'm drawing some thoughts from what Rupa mentioned about. I believe the issue is not about having data. There are sets of data sets sitting digitally in different forms, different pockets. Everybody is asking for data. People are really scared about the data because the data security is a critical issue. I am not even making the data cross the borders, right? Yesterday, Ralph talked about the issue of trade cost when it comes to manufacturing. I think there is a 34% increase, the increase of trade when it comes to services vis-a-vis manufacturing, right? This is a huge, huge number. Don't we think that the issue is not about having a data, but the issue is about having a data at a common point? You know, I think we need something like a data architecture, a mother data architecture, which guides people in the countries that, you know, this is the kind of data I need. This is the quality of data I need. This is where the data will sit. This is the safety of the data, rather than everybody going out of data. Now, when I say data, now data can be pivoted around two elements: enterprise, whether it's investment rate, and people, the social side of it. Just a thought.
Thank you. So I'll take two more questions, and then I'll give the floor to the panelist, Sumanta.
Good morning, everyone. And first, let me thank the World Bank and the WTO, and particularly happy to see Martin, I am Samantha Chaudhary. I've been an international trade negotiator, and currently I also advise the Confederation of Indian Industry as their principal advisor, which is the Apex Industry Chamber in India. Now, I'll just make two quick points, one domestic and one multilateral, though I don't know, I hope what I say doesn't deepen the slumber even more. But that apart, I think the panelists and Martin himself has alluded to the point that when we look at the domestic services environment, first, of course, the issue of data, which is, I don't want to repeat, but more importantly, it's a very diffused, unlike perhaps the goods, the services trade is spread over a huge number, not just of ministries or departments, but regulators as well. And increasingly, you have services regulators for a large number of service sectors. So perhaps there is a case for looking at a framework of a holistic services trade policy, both because the buy-in otherwise for services in general and services trade, therefore, of these departments are largely domestic. And sometimes it's only as a byproduct. And this has a direct bearing on the diversification of services exports. So I think that's something, and this kind of a framework, perhaps UNSCAP and other, of course, the WTO could look at it. The second point on the multilateral side, one, of course, is the trend which we have seen, and again, mentioned by all the panelists, both of cross-border mode of delivery and of digital apps. I mean, things like health tech, ed tech, fintech. When we were actually sitting in room W, well, 2 decades back, Martin, we wouldn't have even perhaps really talked about them. So this has two implications. One, of course, is a classification issue. A large number of new activities are now being done remotely. They are often a combination of not just ICT, but the sector, which means two, one, at the domestic level, you need integration. So if you're going to do health tech, you need the regulatory environments of both to speak each other and look at health tech. Second, when you are looking at trade commitments or in any trade agreement, you will have to look not just at ICT, but you'll have to look at the health sector in relation to this. So this has a major bearing. And I think on this classification kind of thing and the new technology that's happening, again, I think there's a role both at the multilateral level and for regional organizations. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor Jane Kelsey from the University of Auckland in New Zealand. I wanted to pick up on something that Graham Floater said about the world would look very different next week. And the importance through the entire panel of development, including, as Ambassador Falemaka said, digital development within developing countries. Which implies a need for flexibility, for cooperation, and so on. And so it struck me that there was a contradiction between what Graham Floater and Sebastian Desus was saying in promoting the Joint Statement Initiative and e-commerce rules, which are in fact designed to lock in and reduce policy space. They're not a development agenda. They're a template that was developed initially in the TPP and TISA context by and for big tech, which serve to consolidate controls over data, over platforms, over software and technologies. And we're seeing, of course, in the context of those discussions, issues emerging now around data sovereignty, about competition and need to break up some of the big tech monopolies and to ensure that there is policy space available. So I'm a bit perplexed about how you advance digital industrialization and the flexibilities that need to be there. And I noted that in the 4th of August text, that Nigeria, for example, has promoted a carve-out effectively for developing countries based on self-judged needs that would not be subject to dispute settlement, even if it was functioning. New Zealand, my own country, has promoted a carve-out for measures to adopt to reflect the rights interests, duties and responsibilities of Indigenous peoples. And so there is a growing nervousness about the kind of rules that are being promoted at a time that we're talking about development, rapid change, and so on. And so I'm, I suppose, inviting you to think about how the tensions that are emerging now might be done differently to address digital industrialization, digital development in developing countries, and keep space open rather than through the JSIs.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I give the opportunity to panelists to say something in response to these three questions briefly. I see there were other questions too, so let's try to get a few quick answers, and then we'll try to take one or two more questions. Who wants to start?
Well, okay, on the issue of data, I completely agree with you that there needs to be some sort of overall framework. So I think this is where some of the guidelines that are being brought out in terms of classification, how to collect the data. So that broad agreement is required across countries, but that still doesn't mean that, you know, at the national level, the sort of capacity building, the interagency stuff that I was mentioning, that is not required. So that will be needed, but you need a broader guideline and framework to guide that process. I actually really liked your point about separating it out between the enterprises and the people, because there's a big social dimension of all this. And, you know, when we look at things like inclusivity, the jobs, etc., and the kind of disaggregation you need to address those. And again, that comes back to how we collect some of the national data. Again, here, some guidance in terms of how to do it for the firm level enterprises and, you know, the surveys that are required, and then collecting this kind of national information, which shows you the role of services in the broader economy. That is needed. Guidelines, but domestic. I think we cannot go away from the complementarity between international frameworks and how that has to guide the national capacity. In terms of, you know, this thing about being spread across large number of stakeholders, yes. So this is, again, what I was referring to, that international and regional organizations need to provide some of these mechanisms where these different agencies, regulators, industry chambers, you know, these repositories of information which are scattered across, they have to be done. I remember in the Indian context, we had tried through the Ministry of Commerce and reaching out to different, but the participation, because their interests are domestic, as you said, and it's not the international agenda. How do we shape that? I think this is where a bit of external push is needed as to why it's important to look at the domestic and the external linkages. I think, you know, the issue of looking across sectors in trade negotiations, whether the existing classifications are flexible enough. I mean, this is a larger thing for multilateral agencies to look at. And finally, on this point, that's why, I mean, on digital services trade in particular, I think there needs to be a lot more analysis done on the impacts of regulations, on taxation. But here I would also say that countries which are not participating, perhaps there is a need for them to participate to help shape the dialogue. It is important. It's not about locking in, but it is also about trying to bring some of these issues of, you know, competition policy, platforms, monopolies, and things like that, which are affecting their entrepreneurs at the end of the day, their small firms. So unless you sit at the table, I mean, it's difficult to partly shape the agenda. Sitting at the table doesn't always necessarily mean that you have to lock in and bind everything, but you can direct some of the discussion. I would be a little bit more open on that engagement. Thanks.
Thank you, and some thought-provoking questions. Maybe I could pick up on the question about frameworks and also the question about the JI. So on the frameworks, I mean, all I would say really is to agree with Rupa, particularly the point that we really need to be working at different levels simultaneously. It's important that there is capacity building at the national level and at subnational level, but it's also important that we understand how we operate as an international community in order to better use the data that may be out there. And I think the point that you were making was access to the data as well. The data may exist, but how do you access data, and how do you do that in a way that balances, on the one hand, the need to understand what the facts are, so that you can target the benefits for countries more precisely, but on the other hand, of course, respecting the policy space and those areas of data that we need to be careful about going forwards. And that brings me on to the point about the JI, which is, I mean, first of all, what is great about the e-commerce JI is that it brings together so many different countries, many developing countries, developed countries, north, south, east, west, into one place, so that we can have a real conversation about what matters to everybody, so that we can make this as inclusive as possible. What we don't want is individual countries going off on their own and creating a fragmented world, which will inevitably create a lack of fairness and an uneven distribution of the benefits. That's what we need to ensure happens from this process. Now, like any process, there are going to be different interests, there are going to be different elements on the agenda, and that's all part of the approach. But I mean, one thing I would say is that one of the main beneficiaries of the e-commerce JI is going to be micro businesses and SMEs. Just to give some examples, customs procedures. It's often SMEs who are disadvantaged by the customs procedures that they have to undertake in order to get their goods to where their customers are. By digitizing these processes, making it cheaper, faster, easier for SMEs, that's got to be a good thing. Large companies have the resources to be able to understand burdensome regulations, the myriad processes that have to be gone through, even the physical presence of somebody to go along and stamp documents. SMEs don't have that luxury. And that is one area where I think if we can move forwards, it's going to help. In the UK, we have the Electronic Documents Bill, which is trying to do something similar in a different sort of way, which is to say, look, we should be able to do business without having to stamp physical documents. Yes, you can continue to do that if you don't have the digital infrastructure, but where it does exist, let's use it, and let's support, again, the smaller businesses who will benefit most from that. And then in terms of data flows, data is simply a fact of life now in the global economy. If you trade goods, agricultural goods across borders, it is now followed with data on its sustainability, where it came from, its sell-by date, all things that are important for us to know. And if you shut down those data flows, you shut down the global economy, you see prices go up, you see food becoming less affordable. These are the things that we're talking about. So yes, we do need to have a balance. It's true, and that's why we're working very carefully in the JI to look at all the different sides of the argument and ensure we can get that balance right between, on the one hand, the global economy operating as it does today in an effective way, benefiting all, but on the other hand, also respecting the importance of data privacy and also the importance of the right of citizens to understand how their data is being used. So all of that is important, but the JI as an entity is very much about helping those SMEs.
Thank you. Sebastian, please.
Quickly, thank you. On those 3 points, on the first point, yeah, I fully agree with on the need for an overarching framework to try to classify the various services, and then this need to be then embedded in national development, statistical development strategy if they still exist, but which are strategies that define the need, the access, the capacity issues, and that's how it is being landed. But you need for that a global framework to so that every country at least tries to adopt the same framework so that we can exchange data and at least compare data across countries and the evolution. On the classification of service itself, I mean, this is an issue we are struggling very much with at the World Bank too. Is fintech financial services, or is it digital services? This is a very complicated issue. We're trying to approach it from an institutional perspective. Who's the ministry in charge of what? Maybe that's not the best way, but at least that's one way to look at it. But I don't have an answer, but I acknowledge the issue. On the GSI, I just want to say 2 things. We've launched also with the WTO an initiative to help countries in Africa understand better where they currently sit vis-à-vis the provision of the GSI, or the list of regulation or provisions that the GSI is discussing, for them to be better informed of really where they are and what it would take to upgrade maybe the regulatory framework. So that's just one step of trying to bring more information on the table for African countries who want to do so. That regard, and in terms of the impact of digitalization or digitization, or I mean movements toward greater use of digital means. Again, looking at Africa, what we've seen in recent years is that there's huge progress in terms of infrastructure development, access to connectivity. There's huge progress in terms of skills development, so which were traditionally the 2 most important factors that prevent the development of digital services. What we see at the margin increasingly biting is the regulation. And think about a small African country who wants to develop its productive capacity in digital services. Very often the binding constraint now is not anymore access. Of course, more can be done, but there is access. I mean, there are those infrastructure, but they are not used productively. And for 2 reasons. One, because very often it is very costly to acquire those technologies from abroad. So the adoption of technology is made difficult by the trade policy. That's one. And second, because it's all a business of low marginal cost. I mean, the larger, or of economies of scale, the larger your business is, the more competitive you are. And for that, you need to access other markets as well. You're a small producer in Kenya, you want to reach out to Uganda and Tanzania. You need to be able to cross borders with your services. So the domestic regulations, also the issue of competition domestically in service provision, but the regulatory framework and the trade framework for digital services is also very important for the development of production capacity in developing countries.
Thank you, Sébastien. I know there are more questions, but I think unfortunately we have to move on. People have other commitments and have to go to other sessions. I would just encourage you to approach us directly, to get in touch with the panelists if there's anything else you want to discuss. There are many more issues we could, of course, discuss on this. I'm not going to try to summarize, of course, the discussion, but I think it further emphasizes that there is a giant. It may be somewhat sleepy, but there is still a lot of work to do to mobilize our efforts to get it a bit awake and get it moving on the 2 legs, the international cooperation one and assistance domestically. And I think we're all committed to work to try to do that. And so we encourage you to get in touch and discuss with us as you can today and the next days. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.